The buzz around the election of a new pope, well, it always grabs headlines, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
But this latest one, it has some really unique layers. Things that might surprise you, especially if you're keeping an eye on global developments or maybe prepping for competitive exams.
Yeah, definitely. The election of Pope Leo XIV, the very first American pope,
Yeah.
it's a really significant event, just packed with historical context and potential implications. Worth a closer look.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today, a deep dive. We're working from a BBC report here, and we're going to try and unpack it, get to the core of this election.
Okay.
Our aim, really, is to give you a clear sense of its historical weight, how it all actually happened, and maybe those first clues about where Pope Leo XIV might lead the Catholic Church.
Cutting through the noise.
Focusing on what genuinely matters for, your understanding.
So where do we start? That moment the news broke. What stood out about the immediate reaction?
Well, it was striking. Even before the official announcement, you had crowds in St. Peter's Square chanting, "Viva el Papa."
Right, that anticipation.
Huge anticipation. And then the name reveal, Leo XIV. It's quite something to think he's the 267th Pope, successor to St. Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, those iconic moments, the white smoke curling up from the Sistine Chapel.
Signaling the decisions made.
Exactly, that the cardinals and the conclave had agreed. And then his first appearance out on the balcony, pure tradition, but on a massive stage.
Yeah, those rituals carry so much weight historically. But beyond the ceremony, it's the man himself, Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV. His background adds a really fascinating dimension.
He's 69, the first American pope, like you said.
Right. But what the BBC report really emphasizes is his deep, deep connection to Latin America.
That is such an interesting point. Born in Chicago in 1955, but his family roots are Spanish and Franco-Italian. Immigrant heritage.
Yeah.
He was an altar boy, ordained back in '82. But then just a few years later, he went off to Peru for extensive missionary work. Spent years there, eventually becoming a bishop in Peru.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of, on-the-ground experience must really shape how someone sees the world, wouldn't you think?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, 10 years as a local parish pastor, teaching in a seminary in Trujillo, working directly with marginalized communities, trying to build bridges. It paints a picture of a leader who's really connected to everyday life.
And he even holds Peruvian nationality.
Yeah, and is apparently remembered very fondly there. That really underlines the bond. But he didn't cut ties with the U.S. either.
No.
No, he kept coming back, serving as a pastor and prior in Chicago periodically. So it's this kind of truly global background, a foot in both worlds almost.
Okay, so here's a question then. Given he was only made a cardinal relatively recently, how did he become the Pope? That's where the Vatican's inner workings get, well, intriguing.
Precisely. And his role as prefect of the Dicastery for bishops, specifically handling Latin America, seems pivotal. Well, that department is crucial for selecting and overseeing bishops across the region. So it meant he was already very well known and likely respected by many of the cardinals who were actually in the conclave doing the voting.
Okay.
Plus, you have the timeline of his appointments by Pope Francis himself, Bishop of Chiclayo, then Archbishop, then Cardinal, all in a pretty short span.
Right, let's just pause on that. The BBC report specifically mentions that a huge majority, something like 80% of the cardinals in that conclave, the ones electing the new pope, were actually appointed by Pope Francis. That feels like a really key factor.
It absolutely is. I mean, it largely explains why someone seen as aligned with Francis's views could be elected, even without decades as a cardinal.
Right.
It strongly suggests that the electors, well, many of them wanted a continuation of the general direction the church had taken under the previous pontiff, another word for the Pope.
Okay. And what about his first words after the election? Did they offer any clues?
They did seem to. His first address was notable for mentioning Pope Francis really warmly acknowledging his weak but always courageous voice. He also talked about unity, needing to move forward hand in hand with God. And he referenced his own background in the Augustinian order, which gives a little insight into his spiritual grounding.
It's interesting, too, that the BBC included a comment from former U.S. President Donald Trump calling the election a great honor.
Yeah, it shows the global reach, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It goes way beyond just the Catholic community. Okay, so let's shift to the potential direction of his papacy. The report suggests continuity with Francis's reforms is likely.
That's certainly the prevailing view, yeah. Pope Leo XIV is widely seen as someone who will likely continue the path set by his predecessor.
On key issues.
Especially on key social issues, it seems. Things like migrants, concern for the poor, environmental protection. Those are areas where their views appear closely aligned.
We even get that little personal insight from his former roommate, Reverend John Leighton. He described him as outgoing, down to earth, and very concerned with the poor.
And that fits, doesn't it? Especially when you consider his own family background coming from immigrants. That probably shapes his views on migration profoundly.
Yeah, good point.
And that deep Latin American experience provides continuity after Pope Francis, who was from Argentina. So now we have the second pope from the Americas, and interestingly, the first ever from the Augustinian order.
The report does mention, though, a difficult topic, these sexual abuse scandals in his former diocese in Peru.
Yes. It notes the allegations and also the diocese's strong denial that he was involved in any kind of cover-up. But it's undoubtedly a critical issue the Church is still grappling with worldwide.
Before the conclave even started, the Vatican spokesman talked about needing a pope with a prophetic spirit, someone to lead an outward-looking church. How does Prevost, now Leo XIV, fit that mold?
Well, his track record, the missionary work, the focus on marginalized groups, the bridge-building efforts, it certainly suggests a leader who's deeply engaged with the world outside the Vatican walls. His appointment could signal a continued focus on the Church's role in tackling, global challenges.
Okay, let's talk about the name he chose, Leo XIV. The experts in the BBC report see that choice as significant, signaling a commitment to tackling big social issues. What's the history behind the name Leo?
Oh, it carries huge historical weight in the papacy.
Yeah.
You have Pope Leo I, way back in the 5th century, famous for his diplomacy meeting Attila the Hun, persuading him not to sack Rome. Quite the negotiator.
Wow.
But perhaps even more relevant today is Pope Leo III. His time was the late 19th, early 20th century Industrial Revolution, rise of Marxism, huge waves of migration. He wrote really influential documents on worker rights, things that profoundly shaped Catholic social teaching.
And the former Archbishop of Boston, Sean Patrick O'Malley, draws a direct line there, right?
He does. He suggests choosing Leo connects the new pope to Leo XIII's legacy of social justice during another time of, quote, epic upheaval. It really underscores the potential direction.
It certainly does. Okay, so thinking about specific policies, it gets a bit more complex, maybe. The BBC report says his views on LGBT issues aren't entirely clear yet.
That's right. Some conservative groups seem to think he might be less welcoming, perhaps, than Pope Francis was. It's an area people are watching closely.
But he has supported blessings for same-sex couples.
Yes, while also stressing that local bishops need to figure out how best to apply that in their own contexts. It hints at maybe a bit more decentralization or local interpretation.
Okay. What about climate change?
There, his stance seems pretty firm. He's called for moving from words to action, talking about building a relationship of reciprocity with the environment.
And he's pointed to actual Vatican actions.
Yeah, things like installing solar panels, using electric vehicles, showing a practical commitment.
And the role of women in the church. That's always a big topic.
He supported Pope Francis's move to allow women into the Dicastery for bishops. He's acknowledged their input is valuable, that their perspective matters when choosing new bishops, recognizing their contribution in those key decisions.
Right. Okay, let's try and bring this all together. For our listeners, especially maybe those preparing for exams like the UPSC or just following global events closely, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive on Pope Leo XIV?
Well, I'd say three main things. First, just the fact of the first American pope, but one with such deep roots in Latin America that's historically huge and could shift the Church's global focus.
Okay.
Second, his background, combined with how the election unfolded, strongly suggests we'll see a continuation of the reformist path Pope Francis started, particularly on social justice.
Makes sense.
And third, that name choice, Leo. It's loaded with historical significance, pointing towards engagement with major social and global issues, echoing past popes who tackled big challenges. For UPSC aspirants, understanding all this gives really crucial context for international relations, social issues, contemporary history, useful for both prelims and mains, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. So for you, the listener, grasping this appointment offers, well, vital context for what's happening globally, the shifts within a major world religion, and those big ongoing debates about social justice, leadership, and how institutions navigate the modern world.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe something for you to ponder. Given his really unique background, that American birth but deep Peruvian experience and the historical echo of the name Leo, what specific global or social challenges do you think Pope Leo XIV will make his priority?
Good question.
And how might his approach, leading this massive global institution in the 21st century, actually differ from popes we've seen before? It's complex, definitely something to think about.
It really is. And if you found this deep dive helpful, maybe insightful for your own understanding, please do give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe leave a comment. Any questions you still have or other topics you'd like us to explore, let us know.
And just a reminder, our discussion today was grounded in reporting from the BBC.
That's right. Thanks for joining us.